There's drama in 15 minutes from now based on a true story about a man who died but lived to tell the tale. Anton Rogers and Diana Goodman star in Comeback, which is based on the book Second Chance by John Charters. You're watching TVS.
The news from ITN.
Yeltsin wins big in Moscow. Gorbachev says the people have spoken. Mrs. Thatcher tells Moroccans Israel must talk to the PLO. Doctor takes authority to court for working too many hours. And a win for Norwich closes the gap on Arsenal. Good evening. The Soviet leader, Mr. Gorbachev, admitted tonight that not everyone is pleased by the results of his country's parliamentary elections. But he said, the people have spoken and nothing can change that. Many anti-establishment candidates romped to victory. In the key Moscow constituency, 9 out of 10 people voted for Boris Yeltsin, who was sacked by the Communist Party 2 years ago and who'd lost his Politburo job. And in the Baltic states, nationalist groups scored significant successes against official party candidates.
All day, Boris Yeltsin's votes were piling up at the election counting stations. Few went to his hardline opponent. Tonight, the election chairman announced Yeltsin had taken Moscow with almost 90% of the votes. Yeltsin's campaign staff celebrated. Boris Yeltsin's victory in the all-Moscow seat was as massive as the polls had predicted. Given a choice at the voting stations, Muscovites had defied the party line and voted for his style of communism. Shut out of the party hierarchy, Yeltsin had fought off attempts to discredit him and won public backing. And in the Baltics, the Soviet Communist Party took a battering at the hands of pro-independence movements, like here in Lithuania, where non-communist candidates took 2/3 of the seats. And in Estonia, where the Popular Front movement's leader, Edgar Savisaar, and its co-founder, Mario Lauriston, both defeated communists. They'll now sit in the new Moscow Assembly, arguing against Kremlin rule. By giving his country a taste of democracy, Mr. Gorbachev has unleashed a political whirlwind. The Communist Party is still firmly in control, but the opposition now has a voice, both in and outside the party. Ian Glover-James, ITN, Moscow.
The Prime Minister told Israel tonight it must begin to talk to the Palestinians about peace in the Middle East. Mrs. Thatcher was speaking at a royal banquet in Morocco on the first stage of her African tour. She didn't mention the PLO by name, but she said nothing is ever lost by exploring the views of one's opponents.
The Guard of Honour lent an almost theatrical flavour to Mrs. Thatcher's arrival at the Royal Palace here tonight, after the traditional wait for the King. Looking for a way forward on an international Middle East peace conference formed a key part of their discussions. Earlier, in another part of the palace complex, behind closed doors, Mrs. Thatcher had been drawn into the inner sanctum and given an unprecedented and sumptuous lunch by 16 of the King's wives, sisters and daughters. At her hotel, there was no human sign of excitement and not a whiff of the anti-Rushdie demonstrations that have greeted other British visits to the Muslim world. King Hassan has anyway determined to give her a positive show, which the rain had earlier threatened to undermine. The red carpet at the airport was awash for her arrival. Despite the fact that British trade is down to below its 19th century levels with Morocco, Mrs. Thatcher is determined to improve things, supping date milk, though resisting the dates, in order to set the right atmosphere here for her talks. Tomorrow night she'll be far from the Moroccan snake charmers who haunt the market below her hotel. Her VC-10 heads for Zimbabwe and talks with 2 frontline African presidents on what role she can now play to speed the changes in southern Africa. John Snow, ITN, Marrakesh.
The Foreign Secretary, Sir Geoffrey Howe, said in Pakistan tonight that bonds of friendship between the 2 countries would outlive the row over Salman Rushdie's book, The Satanic Verses. Pakistan has banned it. Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto said the book had caused anguish to Muslims.
Fearful of a repetition of last month's bloody riots about satanic verses, police here have banned all gatherings of more than 4 people for the duration of the Foreign Secretary's visit. Sir Geoffrey, welcomed by Pakistan's Foreign Minister Yaqub Khan, said the 2 countries had historic links and a tradition of mutual respect.
These must not be damaged by recent events. On the contrary, I want to look at ways of further deepening the strong ties of friendship between us.
Religious and community leaders delivered a note of protest about satanic verses, but they seemed satisfied with Sir Geoffrey's response.
He is prepared to consider and explore the possibilities of what can be done to see that the Muslim sensitivity is taken care of.
Tonight, the Foreign Secretary met the Prime Minister, Benazir Bhutto. Talks centred on Britain's delight at Pakistan's return to democracy and on Pakistan's bid to re-enter the Commonwealth. Before the row over satanic verses erupted, Sir Geoffrey had planned to go to Peshawar and visit the Afghan refugee camps there, but that's been called off for fear of Muslim demonstrations. He can be sure of a warm welcome from one Islamic organisation here, the Mujahideen Interim Government of Afghanistan. He's meeting their president and some of their cabinet members here tomorrow, offering not official recognition, but certainly encouragement in their fight against the Kabul regime. Vernon Mann, ITN, Islamabad.
Hundreds of armed police and soldiers are surrounding a jail in Guatemala where a group of rioting inmates are holding up to 600 women and children hostage. The prisoners who are armed took over the jail outside Guatemala City, demanding a reduction in their sentences. Tonight they said they wanted a plane to Cuba.
The trouble started when inmates raided the main guard station, seizing 250 rifles. 4 warders and 3 prisoners were killed and 20 people were injured in the shootout that followed. It happened during a special Easter visiting time. Nearly all the 530 hostages are women and children. Some 1,500 soldiers and police have been posted outside the prison. They are heavily armed. The inmates agreed to allow rescue staff to take away hostages who were hurt, including pregnant women. The prison is badly overcrowded. The inmates want better conditions. Their demands also include an amnesty and a reduction in their sentences. Negotiations are continuing. The security forces say they are prepared for a long wait.
The Duke of Edinburgh escaped unhurt today when his horse-driven carriage overturned at Windsor. Prince Philip was able to jump clear from the carriage before it overturned. The Queen was watching him take part in the carriage driving event during the royal family's Easter break at Windsor Castle. The leaders of the National Union of Teachers meeting in Blackpool have warned that their members may strike over plans to recruit unqualified staff into classrooms. Delegates voted today for action strategies to defeat what they called this unacceptable proposal. The government wants the scheme to begin in September. A junior hospital doctor in London has served a writ on the Bloomsbury Health Authority in an attempt to get his working hours reduced by law. Dr. Chris Johnston usually works 120 hours a week. He wants that cut to 72, he says, for his own health and for that of his patients.
10 o'clock this morning and Dr. Chris Johnson ends a 50-hour shift on duty and starts a legal battle with wide-ranging implications. He works a 120-hour week in the maternity unit. Long hours, he says, have resulted in mistakes in prescribing drugs.
Sometimes I put the decimal point in the wrong place, and I know of friends who've made similar mistakes. I know of 2 friends who've given 10 times the appropriate dose of an antibiotic to young babies.
He's served a writ claiming damages from his local health authority for allegedly failing to ensure his health and safety at work, and he's seeking a limit on his hours to 72 a week. He's supported by fellow doctors alarmed at the effects on their lives.
They suffer in their marriages, the divorce rate is high, the suicide rate is up to 3 times the national average.
A copy of the writ was delivered to the Department of Health, who will be closely monitoring a legal action which, if successful, could radically alter working practices in the health service. Ken Andrew, ITN, Central London.
Soccer, and in the First Division, Norwich keep up the pressure on Arsenal, and the race for the bottom clubs is getting tighter. With that and the other sports news, here's Mark Austin.
Norwich are back in the Championship hunt. They beat West Ham 2-0 and are now just 3 points behind leaders Arsenal with a game in hand.
The old favourite Frank McAvenny was back to try to save the Hammers from relegation. Although he did little, West Ham dominated the first half, Stuart Slater having the best of several chances, but nothing was going right. In the second, they thought they'd got a penalty when Paul Ince was bundled over by Phelan, but the ref said no. Having survived all the pressure, Norwich inevitably struck back, Gordon's corner being beautifully met by Andy Lenigan. And 6 minutes from the end, Malcolm Allen made it safe for Norwich. The Canaries are still threatening the big boys for a surprise title. Giles Smith, ITN Sport, Upton Park.
Millwall's Championship hopes have all but disappeared. Thompson tripped Fashanu and the centre-forward took revenge by scoring